So this is an opportunity for the three of us to have a conversation. And the conversation will probably vary pretty widely. But I wanted to start with the issue of leadership. We at Synergos believe very strongly that in addition to partnerships that bring people together, that it is the leadership within every sector and every level of society that makes it possible for people to work together. So maybe starting with the minister, I'd like to ask how you arrived at your style of leadership and how would you characterize it?
Well, thank you very much. I think that leadership is a privilege and an honor. And I'm not sure that as a person, I set out to be a leader. But I think as I went through school and through my life, I was often thrust in positions where you needed to set an example. And my leadership style is really leading from the front. I believe that you should practice what you preach. You know, you should be an example of what you're trying to accomplish as much as possible. So I don't know, it's a very frank, upfront, straight type of leadership. But it's also a leadership that recognizes the very complexity that the world has become now. And in many cases, you cannot accomplish, as you said, unless you are also a partner, unless you can lead peers, unless you can convince the younger people that you're really sincere. They look for sincerity, they look for truth, they look for transparency. So some of those things are attributes that I think a leader of these days needs to practice, and I try to approach my leadership from there.
Thank you. Paul, would you answer the same question and maybe talk about some of your prior experiences that led you to determine your own style?
Yeah, I always find that the most difficult question because you have to talk about yourself. So I always say that ask other people around you what they think about you is probably better than having me explain it to you. But I think the first thing is, as leaders, what we need more than ever is a little bit what you mentioned. You need to be a human being. And first of all, feel good about who you are and know yourself a little bit. Helps. I'm very blessed in a company of this size to have a lot of leaders around me. So I learn from them. And my job has become relatively simple, which is basically focusing on making them become successful. I don't believe in the 10 tips of leadership, but what is very clear is that you have to be a little bit engaged with what is going on in the world, more so now than ever. And some people call it authentic leadership or purpose-driven leadership. If you are not driven by a little bit of a stronger inner compass now than the financial market, if I may say, or the short term, it just doesn't work anymore. And at least I come from an upbringing that we always cared a little bit more about, you know, other things. And being a product of just being born after the World War II, I've seen my parents fight for a better future and focus on what you call the common good. And I think it's our duty to do the same thing in the fortunate position that we're in. We're working on, as a company, we're working on the leadership for 2020 because the world is changing quite dramatically. And you alluded to it already before, Peggy. We need people that are more systemic thinkers, which is very difficult, the complexities of these issues. But people that understand it, that have a certain level of engagement and can boil it down in specific action. And unfortunately, there are not many of them. I wish we would have more high levels of integrity. And then I think the two other ones is humanity and humility are not such bad things after all.
I agree with that. And it's a fairly rare commodity.
It is a scarce commodity.
Maybe I can follow that up with one more question, because it's not so easy to convince shareholders that taking an approach that isn't necessarily automatically connected to the quarterly bottom line is the right approach. And so I'm wondering, this is following up on the leadership question, how you've been able to convince your shareholders, your employees, and your consumers that this is the right way to go.
Yeah, the forces are not always with you, but increasingly they are actually, and I think we're closer to a tipping point than perhaps we realize. What is happening right now is I think we're getting to a point, be it on climate change, be it on inequality, that people increasingly are starting to realize that we need to do things differently. Coming out of the 2007 or 2008 crisis, if you call it that way, I think people have realized that we've done incredibly well by lifting so many people out of poverty. 500 million over the last 20, 30 years, but at the same time people realize that we've left too many behind, or the way that we were growing with enormous levels of debt, government-wise, private debt, overconsumption, is just not a system that's in equilibrium. And I think a lot of business people understand that as well, because if these systems are not in equilibrium, and increasingly you see that being rejected, it's not good for business either. The other thing that helps us is that we're getting to a point that the cost of inaction, in my opinion, is starting to exceed the cost of action. And that is very appealing to business communities. So the financial community is starting to understand that. What we did as a company, we stopped giving quarterly reporting, we stopped giving guidance, we changed our compensation system. And that was very important in the beginning, because we wanted to send a signal that business has to be done for the long term. We also made very clear that we were there for a purpose to serve society, and then the shareholder would benefit. We were not there for the shareholder's benefit. That is a result of what we do. And we've been very vocal about that, and I hear more business people talk about that. That sent a clear signal to our employees of what we were planning to do. That sent a clear signal to the market, and actually also to our partners in the value chain. Increasingly, there is evidence that if you don't do your quarterly reporting, the discussions with the investor community are a little bit more mature and long-term. You tend to attract longer-term investors. So we see that actually happening to the positive side. We've never questioned the fact that we also need to perform. But increasingly, our model, which basically is decoupling our growth from environmental impact, improving social impact, has many things that are appealing to a broad enough group of investors. It is less risk, you take costs out of the system, your innovations have to be at a higher level, so you tend, if you can crack that, you tend to do better. And increasingly, we're able to communicate these positives and win over people. And I think there is a significant group of the investor community, big enough for our company, that does care, and those are the ones that we're trying to attract. Unfortunately, as a last sentence, many of the CEOs, I think, spend too much time catering to their current shareholder base, and we spent a disproportionate amount of time to the shareholder base that we think would be more in line with our business model. Now, I've discovered naively when I became CEO 5 years ago, and this was my first CEO job, and I'm still learning, that it was easier to disinvest shareholders than to attract new ones. But I'm in a reasonable shape now after 5 years. So.
Great. Well, congratulations. Minister, the voices of poor communities and poor people are often ignored by more powerful actors, even when those actors have the best of intentions. How can we make development more inclusive, and what have you been able to do in your own government to include the people of Nigeria in the development that's been so rapid and so extraordinary?
Well, thank you very much. I have to say that, you know, it's a real challenge, you know, the inclusion of poor people in development. And we have a history of having grown rapidly, but growing with inequality. Mm-hmm. So the quality of the growth in the country is what we really need to focus on. Yeah. I think the biggest way to include the voice of poor people that we found is really through being a real democracy. And as you know, Nigeria was a country that for 4 decades was under military rule. And since 1999, we've had a functioning democracy, and it's become even more so with the recent formation of a very strong opposition party. And so that has also put the ruling party on its toes. And I think getting the voices of people through the elected representatives is certainly one way, but it's not always the foolproof way. Mm-hmm. And what we are learning is that really in trying to make change, we have to work very concretely at 3 or 4 levels. One is in my country, which is fairly large, 170 million people, 36 states and a federal capital territory, 774 local governments, and so many communities and wards that we've got to get a partnership going between the federal government, the state, the local government, and even the communities, you know, in order to make change. If we don't have all four coming together, then it's very difficult to involve people. The good side of the equation is that Nigeria is a country where traditionally we've got associations in our villages, associations of women, of men, traditional associations that group together to accomplish things. So we've also found as a government that in trying to set up programs, trying to involve those associations, giving them a voice in what we're trying to do is another effective way of reaching them. Do we have it all sorted and solved? I don't think so. I think that there's still communities where you could use more of a voice. And one of those voices or sets of voices is the voice of women. Women often give you the authentic feel for what is going on down on the ground. And so trying to get women more empowered and involved in programs is certainly another method through which we're trying to give voice to the people. Lastly, we are finding a very interesting challenge. Our youth are increasingly on the internet. And this has really empowered them. Because whether you want it or not, they give voice to what they want government to do and what they want the people to do through the medium of engaging on the internet, on Twitter, on all the social media. And this can be sometimes a force for the good, mostly it is, and sometimes it's a challenge.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It's because they're young.
Yeah. Maybe I can follow that up with another question about, because you mentioned including state government and local government and even communities. What do you see as the role of the business sector and investors and also of the civil society in Nigeria?
We think that you know, the role of the private sector and civil society are really key. The private sector we've acknowledged as a government, particularly this government. You have a president that is very friendly to the private sector to the extent of bringing them into the economic management team that, you know, does the thinking and the work for the economy. We have private sector members because we've acknowledged that government sometimes cannot run certain of the services we are supposed to run. Take the power sector, which is quite a strong gap in our country. We've privatized all our power assets except distribution and sold them off to the private sector in one of the most transparent deals, acknowledging that over the years we have not been very competent to do that. We believe that the biggest thing we need to do in creating jobs, government, of course, cannot do it alone. We need the private sector to do that. We need to create 1.8 million jobs a year in Nigeria for new entrants. At the moment, we are creating 1.6 million, so we are still short of our goal. And without private sector involvement in creating jobs and helping us deliver services, this dynamic growth that we have seen now cannot be sustained. We also believe that to reach and include more people, we need to partner with the private sector. And I'll just give you one example. We do not have, it's very difficult to have targeted social programs in my country because people do not have the identity cards and the information that will enable you to sort out who is the truly poor from who is not. So we launched a partnership to set up an identity card system, and we launched it with MasterCard. We thought that we would, so we're doing a pilot of 13 million people. It's a very big pilot. They say it's one of the biggest. The pilot is as large as some countries. So we're doing this pilot and loading on the MasterCard, you know, for electronic and e-wallet so that people can make payments and be included in the financial services. So this is also the way that we're working with the private sector. Now with civil society, we strongly believe that a country or a nation that does not have that voice of civil society working cannot be a truly functioning nation. You need to have that voice, you need to have the criticism, You need the partnership to deliver services to. It's not always that the private sector can do it or government. And civil society comes in. So in Nigeria, you have a very vibrant civil society. And all we want from civil society, sometimes we joke that, you know, we don't want NGIs, non-governmental individuals. We want through NGOs, non-governmental organizations, you know, so once we have those, we believe there should be a voice for constructive criticism and for delivery of services.
Thank you. Paul, you've interestingly described Unilever as the world's largest NGO. And I was wondering, in that capacity, whether you have any advice on how the civil society and business can collaborate with government to fulfill the social mission that you've described.
Yep. Well, that statement came from when I was with my friend Mohamed Yunus on one of the panels, and he claimed to be the biggest NGO, and I made clear to him that I wasn't government either. And so the definition of non-government organization also fit our company very well. But if you seriously, if you think that all your brands need to be to the service of society, and we really mean this when we bring Lifebuoy out there, it is to fight the infectious diseases where still 4 million children under the age of 5 die every year. Or when we bring our food products out, it's to fight the stunting when you have 160 million people stunting. Or when we have our toilet cleaner brands, it's to fight against the open defecation where you have 1.1 million people. Or the food security issues where you have 860 million people still going to bed hungry. All these things are enormous market opportunities, believe it or not. And if your brands actually provide these solutions, society will accept you. But you cannot do it alone. Often you deal with a group of the population that is difficult to be accessed in a reasonable way, or companies don't have necessarily that capacity. So you need to work together, I think, in these partnerships to achieve that. And increasingly, we're getting these partnerships established, be it with governments, be it with civil society. And we need everybody there. I'm not anymore in the camp of saying this is the responsibility of one or the other. This is all of our responsibility to solve it. Now, I think we're entering a period a little bit, which, if you want to be realistic, that the political environment globally is very difficult. The reasons you don't get climate change agreements or Doha rounds or any of the other things, a watered down Rio agreement, is if you have now 193 or 200 governments in a room, it's not a pretty picture. And probably if we would run our company on every decision with 200 people in the room, it wouldn't be a pretty picture either. But it's clear that the economic process has become more short-term. Ngozi was already alluding to that, has become a little bit more internally focused. And our institutions, our global governance, hasn't really adjusted to an incredibly interdependent world. And that's why you see Syrias and all these things becoming soap operas on television without us taking any actions or other things. So I think we're going into a period of probably the next 10 or 15 years where probably more of the initiative has to come from the private sector, who quicker will see in their own P&Ls the effect of this dysfunctioning. A company like Unilever has 300–400 million euros extra cost now already because of climate change. The colds in the US because of, or the Hurricane Sandy's, or the shipping routes to the Philippines, or the floods in the UK, they all cost money. And what you see is a period probably in the next 10–15 years where businesses will take these initiatives and then more so than governments, and then form coalitions around it. But you do need these governments, you do need these frameworks, and you do need civil society, I think, to be sure that it's all done in the wishes and to the benefits of the people that we're trying to serve. And these coalitions are happening in an increasing amount.
Can you give an example of one?
I'm very happy to do that on many different fronts, but one of the things we are passionate about, and Jeff Horowitz is here in the audience, is the Tropical Forest Alliance we have created. I see Jeff sitting there. But it's very clear that the world has a problem with deforestation, which is 15% of global warming, so it's a big issue. 30% of the world's forests are gone, 20% of the land is degraded. Half of the deforestation is actually driven by the demand for food. As we've lifted people out of poverty, people going to the middle class, changing their dietary habits, enormous demands on food. So if you're partly a food company like ours, you have to take co-responsibility. So we created a forum, a consumer goods forum, biggest retailers, manufacturers, Walmart included in the US, or many others, Kroger and many that you know, but also the Cokes or the Crafts and other companies. And we said by 2020, we're not going to sell any products anymore that come from what I would call illegal deforestation. So you talk about soy, pulp, palm oil, beef, and many other of these commodities. That sent an enormous signal up the supply chain, obviously. We're now working with the, in our case, palm oil is a big ingredient we use. We're working with the Indonesians, Malaysians, the growers. And what you find is you bring the right group of people together, about 30 or not more is actually needed, and you get to a tipping point. One of the biggest palm oil growers is Wilmar. It's 45% of the palm oil market. We got them to agree on no deforestation, carbon capture, and then actually livelihoods is very important. And this is galvanizing the industry. Others are coming in. So that's a typical example of tipping points. Food security in Africa. We're working now on the Grow Africa, or the New Vision for Africa. One of the projects in Nigeria on cassava. But bringing coalitions together across the whole value chain, starting with the smallhold farmer to creating livelihoods, and doing that in a sustainable way, bringing in things like nutrition at the same time. Then you discover, indeed, it is about women, it is about land rights. So these issues come in. Then it's just not only about nutrition, about food, it's about nutrition. So you get into those things. And the circle enlarges. And if business is not an active part of this, these issues simply will not be solved. Philanthropic organizations or money coming from the private sector now far outweighs the overseas development aid, which frankly has given a limited level of return. Yeah. So that's the real thing that we have to change.
Thank you. You just mentioned philanthropy, and we were talking before that you founded the Nigerian Philanthropy Forum. I wonder if you could comment what role you see philanthropy playing in Nigeria and in your experience around the world. We have here many members of the Global Philanthropist Circle, and I'm sure they'd be very interested in your answer.
Well, thank you very much, Peggy. I really do think that the world is changing so much in terms of the actors in the space, in the financial space, and the capacity building space for development, especially for sustainable development. And philanthropy is becoming ever more and more important. I think you've been with philanthropy here in the US and other parts of the world, maybe much longer. We found that in our country too, and in many African countries, you have people who have recently become wealthy, you know, millionaires and billionaires who also want to give back. And, but the way to do it, we found them working in pockets, doing good, but from our estimate when we stand back, the total impact, the totality of what they're doing is not really being felt. You have companies with foundations, you know, Shell, you know, the big companies, you know, Unilever. I don't know if you have a foundation in Nigeria. But, you know, you have Shell, ExxonMobil, the typical companies. But you then have families and individuals. The Tony Elumelu Foundation, the Dangote Foundation, the T.Y. Danjuma. These are people who have made money in business and become billionaires and millionaires, and they want to help. So when we look strategically, we found that what they were doing, even though good, was not strategic, was not maybe fitting into the space where government was absent. And that led to the idea of why don't we bring the philanthropists together into a philanthropy forum where we could just share with them where we thought that government was deficient or there were gaps, and see how that, and where we thought strategically they could fit in, not just now, but thinking through to the future. And then see how, you know, their interests, because it's their money, it's their time, it's their vision for the organization, how would those interests fit into this space? And it was a very interesting meeting. The first forum, we've actually only had one, about 35 people in the room, both from organizations, the companies I spoke about, as well as these foundations. And they found it very, very useful. Because when you're a small foundation or a philanthropic organization, you don't have a sense. You have a sense at an individual level that you've made an impact on someone's life or a family's life. But overall, are you really having that kind of result or impact systemically that you would like to have. And so many of them were grateful to see that the government had taken the trouble. You know, we hired McKinsey to help us, of course, to try and scope out, you know, where these spaces were that we thought they could fit. In education, we have great difficulty in our education system, and we're trying to change. What are the gaps, and where can people work? In the health area, very popular with many organizations, where can they work? And so I think the advice I would have really is that if you're a small foundation, you can still make a difference if you can find that missing gap between what the government is trying to deliver and what you're doing, or if you can enhance what is already underway and be part of it. But, you know, working in isolation is probably not an option these days.
Thank you. Yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think these foundations can actually move faster. They actually have more money now than the governments do, as with the US and Europe actually shrinking, if you believe it or not. And they actually can bring that credibility that is often missing if you only would have the private sector or the government. We work, for example, with the Moore Foundation in the UK, with smallhold farmers in Africa. We have 2 million smallhold farmers that work for us, many in the tea business. We don't want them to be 100% dependent on us. That would not be right. Getting a foundation in there is very helpful. We do hand washing in schools with all for sanitation. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or the Children Investment Fund in the UK, big charitable institutions. And what you find working with them is usually that money comes from or has its origin in business in the first place, that many of these people that run these foundations also try to look at it in terms of investment and return and making it truly sustainable. And it's actually easier for us to work with them. And at the same time, they have a bridge that has more credibility or is better with the governments, which you need to include as well, than the private sector alone would do. So increasingly, they play an enormous role. And that is the same with the government foreign development aid, be it Russia here or in US aid, or Lillian Ploemen in the Netherlands, or Justin Greening in the UK. Increasingly, these countries require this aid to be linked to sustainable projects. And getting these partners on board in many of the things we're working on, I think is absolutely instrumental, not only to keep us honest, which I think is absolutely important, also to be sure that it is about the individual you're trying to solve, and also to avoid a total dependence in a commercial relationship that never will be balanced. So an enormously important role.
May I add something? I also believe that the philanthropic sector can bring a dynamism and innovation and use of new tools, which maybe the government and maybe even the private sector may not be able to bring, because they're smaller, they're more nimble, more agile. They can also bring to bear technologies and new knowledge that you may not be aware of and be willing to try them faster. So I think they're really a complement, you know, in what government and private sector are able to do. But if they can somehow, you know, be able to strategically support what is ongoing or fill in a space that there's a void, that's very, very helpful.
We sometimes say that the best philanthropy is like the venture capital of the social sector, so that it can take risks, it can afford to fail, it can test out new possibilities. So turning to a less pleasant subject, we know that corruption is growing in all sectors and in all countries. And I'm just wondering, I would love to have you each speak about ways in which you think we collectively as human beings, but also as institutions, as governments, as businesses, can offset what appears to be a very nefarious and growing trend.
You want me to kick it off? No, it's fine, because I think businesses, from where business stands, by the way, for every person that is corrupted, there is a corrupter. It's on both sides. And in Africa, it's obviously a big problem. 50 billion goes in there in development aid and 70 billion leaves. And the capacity building to collect some of the revenues or tax systems, etc., is not there. So it's a big problem. Ultimately, responsible business understands that as well. So we have a very clear policy that we would help governments build this capacity. a UK Foreign Corruption Practice Act, which we fall under 100% square and fairly, is actually very good in my opinion, because it makes you globally liable for things that might happen in other parts of the world. And as a result, being in many of these countries, we can be catalyzers for change. There's no doubt in the work that we've done on the Millennium Development Goals that if we want to create this better world for all that we're all talking about, it is first and foremost about having the right governance, having the institutions work, access to legal systems, and obviously corruption is a big part of that, or fighting that. And it shows up in many different ways. In our business, counterfeit is another form of corruption, for example. So we would do our utmost. And the good thing is in places like Africa, because we have a long colonial history with the Dutch and the Brits as being a dual nationality company, if you want to. We've been in most of these places for 100 years or more. And I think we'll continue to play that role of trying to set these standards. And contrary to what you say, where you have a feeling that it's actually getting worse, I would actually think it is getting better, to be honest. The data that we're picking up or what we're seeing, I think that increasingly people are starting to understand that things need to be done differently. And one of the reasons I believe why you see Africa coming up and why it's a continent that is now increasingly in vogue, we're one of the bigger companies in Africa, but is that growth is being unlocked, and that is because a lot more people are looking at operating under principles that provide the right climate for that.
Thank you. Minister?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a very difficult but very important subject, and I think it's a global phenomenon.
It is.
As you said, from the work that I've been doing. Very recently, the finance ministers of Africa set up a panel headed by former President of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, to look at the issue of illicit flows of funds out of the continent. As Paul mentioned, there are numbers like 50 billion leaving the continent and more. But we found out that, there are 3 or 4 sources. One is, of course, corruption done by officials of money that goes abroad. But one of the biggest sources is transfer pricing. That is, multinational companies and others that don't pay their fair share and find a way of transferring their profits to very low tax jurisdictions. And so they mine natural resources, for instance, but they don't pay the tax that they should on that. And this is a very big source of the illicit funds leaving the country. And of course, there are perfectly legitimate tax loopholes. So it's not that every money that escapes from a company is illegal. No. I mean, if you can make use of the loopholes in the taxation of a country to send your money, fine. But we are talking of illegal means of over-invoicing, under-invoicing, deliberate evasion of tax. And what is showing up is that this is a huge amount of the problem. So like Paul was saying, we really have to work with companies to make them responsible taxpayers within the jurisdiction in which they do their business, because this is one of the big forms of corruption that we find. The other is, of course, officials, and the one that is more popular, corruptly taking assets out of the country. And there, I believe, on both counts, I believe that our countries need strengthening and capacity building. Transfer pricing and all that is a very sophisticated business. And if you don't have the proper training for the tax administration and tax authorities, we cannot. The other issue is negotiating proper contracts for natural resources, where there's a complete asymmetry of information. On the one side of the table, you've got the lawyers with the companies and so on, very sophisticated. You've got governments with weak capacity who cannot negotiate good contracts. So this is a problem that is solvable and has to be solved. On the part of corrupt officials, the first port of call is within the country itself. We must take our own responsibility to also do more to stop this and to, less impunity. And in my country, we are struggling with this, how to grapple with that. But at the same time, we've also found that there's a global dimension where this money is going. As we said, there are 2 sides of the equation. And in my country, we've got, as I speak, we have identified, we've been able to recover $2.5 billion of money that was corruptly taken out of the country under the former dictator Abacha, the military ruler. We have discovered another $1 billion Luckily, the US has very stringent laws that now allow you to freeze money, and they just froze $458 million across various jurisdictions. But some countries in Europe, maybe I should name them, I have to say, are keeping our monies. You know, Liechtenstein and Luxembourg. What the hell? Let me name them.
Starts with an L.
You know, and they've been keeping this money for 15 years, and they won't let go, even though we've identified that this is our money that was taken out. But the laws, even the UN Convention Against Corruption, which everybody has signed, that should enable you to send the monies back, they still find every reason to keep these monies. And this is money that could, you know, if you get this money back, you don't need people to send you any aid. Nigeria is a very small recipient of aid, so we are not dependent. But I'm saying there are other countries that have this. Why do you give aid on one hand and then keep the money on the other hand? So just send the money back. So these are some of the things. I think we need a global partnership to make it work. We must take our responsibilities in our countries, starting from, you know, the scratch. Then the last point I want to make is on institutions. Sometimes, as I work increasingly in this space, I find that the weakness or absence of institutions sometimes drive ordinary people who would want to do things right to doing the wrong thing. Let me give you a very concrete illustration of what I mean by absence of institution. In my country, you know, in the US here, you monitor housing starts, the way the housing sector is doing, like a hawk, because it's a driver of economic growth. In my country of 170 million people, we don't have a truly functioning mortgage system. We have maybe 50,000 mortgages in a country of 170 million. What does that mean? If someone wants to buy a house, if a young couple working, both of them want to buy a house, it's almost an impossibility. They have to wait their whole working lifetime to save. And no human being is different from the other. Everyone wants a roof over their head. So you find that people are looking for all ways and means to try and save money. And as I looked into it more, I found that some of these missing things. So one of the things we need to do is set up a mortgage system where people can walk in and borrow money, and they don't have to desperately be looking for money in every which way, leading to petty corruption, you know, on the part of people. So that's one of the things that we have launched in the country. For the first time, we have set off a remortgage refinance institution to pump more liquidity into the economy. We're working with multilateral partners to set up PMIs, primary mortgage institutions, to pump more mortgages for young people. It also gives them hope. It gives them ownership in the country and in what is happening. You know, and it makes them feel like they don't have to do anything other than the normal. Go to work, earn their salaries, and fulfill their dreams. So this is one of the missing pieces. People don't realize how important it is. If you look around and you want to buy a house or build a house, and there's nowhere to go, what do? So we should also focus on institutional weaknesses, missing links, and capabilities within our countries that make people behave in untoward ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I love the term that you ended on, looking at what are the missing links. And I think actually that's a great way for us to end here this discussion tonight, because we have a lot of people of goodwill, of intelligence, with a lot of connections, with a lot of international reach here in this audience. And if we assigned ourselves each the task of looking for the relevant missing links where we could make a difference, I think the people in this room could make a big difference in the world. So I want to thank our honorees and our panelists, and we're going to be moving on to dinner. So thank you. A big hand.